Hey guys, thanks for joining us at Church of the Crossroads online. For those of you who maybe are joining us for the first time, welcome. We're glad you're here. For those of you who have been a part of Church of the Crossroads for a while, have I got some good news for you? Hopefully it's good news for you. It's good news to me. Next week, we're going to regather. We're going to meet again at Mount Washington Elementary School at our normal service times, 9:30 and 11. Details to follow on just some of the precautions that we're going to be taking and that you will need to take as you come in. But next week, July 19th, we're back together. Can't wait. Can't wait. Before we get into the rest of our service, why don't we, for some of you, this is great news. And so for those of you who are great news, before we get started, why don't you high five whoever you're watching this with at your watch party and say, next week we're going to church. For those of you who maybe this isn't so good news because now you're going to have to put on real pants, why don't you just fist bump somebody and say, man, I'm going to put on pants and go to church next week. And then we'll continue.
Brought me out of darkness, you have filled
In the 14th century, in what's now known as Belgium, there was a duke who was named Reynold III, and he became king. Now, Reynold III had a nickname. They called him Reynold the Fat because he was just grossly, morbidly obese. He was incredibly fat, right? So Reynold the Fat. At some point in time, Reynold the Fat and his brother Edward had a feud that turned violent, and Edward eventually overthrows Reynold and placed him in prison. Sort of. The story goes, Edward built a room around Reynold, and he left the door unlocked. And Edward said, Reynold's not a prisoner. He's free to leave whenever he's ready to leave. The problem was the door to Reynold's room was built extremely small, like too small for Reynold the Fat to get out. It was too small for him because of his size. So it wouldn't have been a problem, though, normally for a prisoner to lose weight while in prison, but Edward, knowing Reynold the Fat's appetite, fed Reynold the richest, fattiest, tastiest foods in the land. And because of that, Reynold was never able to leave his room. He was a prisoner to his own appetite. Today we're going to talk about temptation. Because the truth is, all of us at some point are in prison to an appetite of some sort. Maybe not to food, but to some other temptation, some other sin. So this morning I want to begin to identify the place of your temptation, the pull of your temptation, and then I want to talk about the power to overcome it. And we'll do that again by looking at the life of David as we have been the last few weeks. Here's where we're at in David's story. So Saul is still king, and Saul hates David. He's envious of David, and he's now in an all-out manhunt for David. Like, Saul has his best military men, his Navy SEALs, his Army Special Ops on David's trail. David is running and he's hiding with his men. And in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1, it says this: After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. All right, so David is on the run, and he's in the desert. Now, it's not a desert in the way that we think of deserts. It's not a sandy desert with cactuses and sand dunes. This is a rocky, like, mountainous area. It's dry and arid like a desert. That's why they call it a desert, but it's mountainous. It's rocky. And it's in this place. It's in this desert where David's temptation will take place. Throughout the Bible, the desert and in some translations or in other places of the Bible, the wilderness, the desert and the wilderness are equated to personal suffering and temptation. In fact, Jesus, right before he begins his ministry, is fasting in the desert for 40 days. He's in the Judean desert, and it's there he's tempted at least 3 times that we know of by the devil. So the desert is a desolate place. It represents desperation. Like you don't have what you need in that season or in that place. You'll do anything to get out. The wilderness or the desert represents being overwhelmed, being desperate, therefore tempted. And the temptation while in the desert is to do whatever it takes and compromise in order to get out of the suffering or in order to get out of the pain. Think about it like this in your own life. Those days where, let me get real practical, maybe real personal. Those days where you feel fat or ugly or your clothes are outdated. Those days you're tempted to escape maybe by eating. Eating becomes your comfort. Those days where you feel lonely and isolated and unloved, like that's your desert, and you're tempted in those times to look at pornography to escape, or look at pornography to feel loved in some way. See, what happens is when we're in the desert, when we're feeling unloved or in pain or desperate, when we're suffering, we'll do anything to escape the suffering or escape that feeling, even if it's just for a little bit. That's temptation. In the music Hamilton, I've not seen it. It's being promoted on TV right now. But I've heard some of the story, some of the music. And in the story, in the musical, Alexander Hamilton is trying to pass this financial plan through Congress. It's a stressful time. His wife is away, out of town, and this woman catches him in a vulnerable moment. Like, it's a desert time for Alexander Hamilton, and this woman catches him in this desert, in this vulnerable moment, and she throws herself at him, and he sings in the musical this prayer: Lord, help me say no to this. I don't know how to say no to this. But he can't say no, and he gives in. Let me ask you this. Do you know this about yourself yet? Do you know when you are in your desert, that place of temptation? And do you know what you habitually run to or escape to when you, or what you do to habitually soothe yourself? Like, it's that thing that when you're in the middle of the desert, you tend to want to do. Maybe it's sex or porn. Maybe it's things like shopping. Maybe it's cleaning incessantly just to try to gain a little bit of control in this little area. But maybe it's alcohol. Maybe it's some other substance that will numb your pain. Maybe it's you run to the workshop, or you run to the lake to avoid tension, the pain, the suffering for just a little bit. Like, the desert is your place or your time when temptation is at its worst. But let's talk about that's the place of temptation. Let's talk about the pull of temptation. Saul finds out the area where David is hiding. Right, he's in the desert of En-Gedi, so he goes to that region, he goes to that area, and he takes his men, he takes the Marines with him to find David. And in verses 2 through 4, it says this: So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and David and his men were far back in the cave. They're in the dark. They're in the back of the cave hiding. And so the men who are with David say, this is the day. This is it. This is the moment the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. So here's what's happening. David and his men are hiding in a cave. Saul, needing a potty break, stops, and he just happens to walk into the same cave. David and his men are in the back of the cave, like they're back there in the dark. They're holding their breath so no one sneezes and so no one coughs and gives themselves away. Saul goes in to relieve himself, take care of business, and he disrobes. And David's men whisper, this is it. Look at this. God has delivered Saul into your hands for you to kill him. Like we literally have him with his pants down. Now, how tempting must this have been? Think about David. You've been on the run for your life. The worry, the fear, the paranoia, always looking over your shoulder. You're homeless. You're sleeping when you can sleep in caves. Like, if you take care of this now, if you kill Saul now, it could all be over. your suffering would end right now. Like this would have been good in just about every way. David's suffering would end. David would get the throne and all the luxuries and the riches that come with being the king. This would have been good for Israel too, because Saul was a bad king. Like if David would kill him right here, right now, he's out of the wilderness. He's out of the desert. And this, listen, is the pull of temptation. Temptation finds its power in making disobedience look as if it makes sense. Let me say that again. Temptation finds its power in making disobedience look as if it makes sense. For David, his friends are encouraging him. They're showing him all of the benefits. Like that's the power and the pull of temptation too. Like disobedience here makes sense, and it looks like it has all kinds of benefits in our culture, in our own lives. Here are some of the ways that I see, and we probably all see this play out. Like think about some of these scenarios. You're dating. You're engaged. Your friends might tell you, you might even have seen this and decide you want to do the same. You should move in together before you get married, right? You can save money that way because you only have to pay for one apartment lease. You're getting married anyway. This way you can get some things together before the wedding. And if you move in together, this will kind of make sure you don't lose them. This will tighten the knot. And like that sounds good, but it's justifying sin. For you college students, right? You're getting ready for, at least you were a couple months ago, right? You're getting ready for the final test in a class that you struggled in, and if you don't pass the test, you may not graduate, or you may have to take the class again and pay for the class again, and you've already paid good money for this education. You've already paid for this class, and so because you've been struggling in the class, you don't want to pay for it again. You already paid good money for this class. You'll just cheat this one time. And that sounds okay. That sounds good. Like the end result is good. You graduate. But it's justifying sin. For those of you who are married, she's not good to me. He's not loving me like I think he should. She's not sexually available anymore. He's so busy with work he doesn't even notice me anyway, so why not feel loved for a little bit and flirt with him or her? Give yourself permission because it makes sense and it has benefits. So you flirt and it feels good. And you forget about the pain at home. And then you give in. The excitement of the chase, the secret meetings, and it's an escape and it numbs the suffering at home. You want to feel and you deserve to be loved, even if it's a pseudo-fake alternative to unconditional marital love. So you turn to an affair to get what you're looking for. And it's a compromise. It's a justification of sin. That's the pull of temptation. Disobedience in the moment seems to make sense because it relieves our suffering in that moment. And we want to make sure we don't suffer, or we want to make sure suffering goes away. So what we do is we compromise, we rationalize, we explain our sin away, we make excuses for our disobedience because it kind of makes sense. There was a story I heard about two businessmen who were sent from the main office up to a satellite office for 2 weeks, and so they stayed in a hotel for 2 weeks together. And toward the end of their stay, the hotel called their company, and evidently housekeeping had walked into their room one morning while they were gone and found a suitcase. Listen to this, full of hotel candy, full of hotel mints. Now, I don't know how they got a suitcase full of the hotel mints. Were they walking through the lobby every evening and emptying the free mint basket? Did they grab a a full basket out of the housekeeping cart. However they got it, it was evident they weren't just grabbing one from the road as the candy was intended to be. They stole a bunch. Their boss called them home, canceled their trip, made their trip, shortened their trip, and when they got home, they sat across the table from their boss, and he fired them. They lost their jobs, their prestigious big corporate jobs, for stealing candy. That's a terrible way to go out. And in the moment, for some reason, I don't know why or what the rationale was, but for some reason, the reason they did that is because it made sense to them. That's just candy. All right? That's just how we rationalize. It's just candy. It's just flirting. It's just porn. It's just gossip. It's just no one's getting hurt. Like, that's how temptation starts. No one's getting hurt. But often temptation ends with this. What was I thinking? What was I thinking? And the truth is, you were thinking when it all started, it makes sense. It made sense to you at the time. That's what you were thinking. So, David, encouraged by his men, he makes his move, right? He combat crawls up. He sneaks up with ninja-like quietness. And in verse 4, it tells us that David, with his knife, ends up not killing Saul. He just secretly, quietly cuts off a piece of Saul's robe. So he doesn't kill him, he just cuts off a piece of the robe. And in verse 6, it says, he comes back and he says to his men, Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay a hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. With these words, then David sharply rebukes his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And then Saul leaves the cave and goes on his way. So David comes back and he says, I can't kill him because God forbids me. Like, I have no right to take his life. And then verse 9. Then David, so Saul goes on his way, and then David walks out of the cave. So where Saul's just done his business. David walks out of the same cave, and he calls to Saul. He says, my Lord, my king, my Lord the king. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed and prostrated himself with his face to the ground, and he said to Saul, why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. My friends urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on the Lord. I will not lay my hand on the Lord because he is the Lord's anointed. And then he holds up this piece of the robe and he says, see, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but I did not touch you. I did not kill you. Could have. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I'm guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I've not wronged you, but you were hunting me down to take my life. And then after this in verse 22, it says, then Saul goes on his way. Saul goes home. And it says David and his men go to a stronghold. Now here's what I want you to see. For David, instead of ending his suffering by ending Saul's life, David spares Saul's life, and then he brings about more suffering. Like David uses his power to bless Saul. David obeys even though it means more pain and hardship for himself. So the question this morning when it comes to temptation is, how does David have the power to do this? How does David have the self-control not to give into the temptation? Like, who would choose obedience that leads to more suffering rather than obedience that ends the suffering? Like, why and how did David do this? And here's the answer, verse 12. David says to Saul, "May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you." Verse 15, "May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May the Lord consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand." Here's where David's power and self-discipline come from. You know what he said? David is banking on the fact that God will judge both he and Saul. He says both of us will sit in the courtroom of God, and God will judge us both. And that gives David the power to say no. It would make no sense if David thinks his verdict will be guilty and God will punish him forever. Like, it would make no sense for David to spare Saul's life if David was going to be found guilty anyway. But David knows and is convinced that God's verdict on him is going to be complete innocence. Maybe even he's going to be found to be righteous. And so knowing that, having confidence in that, David needs nothing else. His decision to say no to the temptation at the same time is at the same time him saying, I don't need comfort. I can endure suffering. I don't need the luxury of the throne. I could even give it all away because I know that God is for me. God is all I need, and I have him. And that gives him the power to say no to the temptation. The power to overcome temptation, listen to this, is found in the true love of the Father, the true love of Jesus. I believe once you have that true love, once you have the one that loves you the most, everything else, all the other things that are tempting get displaced, even seem foolish. They're not as important anymore. They don't have power over you anymore. They can't imprison you, own you, enslave you anymore. David gave away comfort. David gave away riches and power, and he chose suffering and pain for the love of God because he loved the Lord. So how do we, with that, overcome temptation? Jesus himself, I said this earlier, was tempted in the desert by Satan. And Satan tempted Jesus basically by saying this. He says, I will take away your suffering right now if you'll just compromise. If you just compromise on this, I will take away your suffering right now. That's what Satan says to Jesus. God says to Jesus, God promises Jesus, you will have everything eventually. But first you have to suffer the cross. See, Satan's temptation is immediate gratification, instant gratification. See, Satan promises a way out. He promises instant comfort to Jesus. And Jesus says, nope, because he has to endure the cross. He has to endure the suffering of the cross so that you and I can be made innocent. And listen, the cross, Jesus' sacrifice, is the moment that God proves he loves you and that you are worth it to him and that he is for you. He's committed to you. What this does for you, once you get this from your head as a great theological idea and let it sink and move to your heart, what this does for you is then you can, with confidence, say, Jesus is enough. His riches are coming eventually. I can wait on those. His reward is coming. I can wait on those. He's trustworthy and he will come through. I can wait on him. I may suffer a little longer, but in the end, he will come through. So, no, I will not compromise what God has set before me. I will not give in and make excuses and allow myself to disobey because I'm waiting on what God has in store for me. I want to see what God has planned for me. I love him. And I want to see what he has for me. Titus 2:11 through 14 says this: For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. And it's that grace that teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age, while we wait for the blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all wickedness and to purify for himself a people that are his very own and who are eager to do what is good. How do you overcome temptation? How do you have the power to say no to compromise? You drink deeply from the grace of God in Jesus Christ. You are his. He is yours. And he's enough. This morning, if you've been investigating Jesus and you're ready to drink deeply from the grace of God in Jesus, you're ready to recognize that you are a sinner and need a Savior, and Jesus, through his death, burial, and resurrection, he's your Savior and offers you forgiveness, and he's your hope. He's your hope of being risen, resurrected to new life yourself, and live for eternity. If you're ready to make that decision, please contact us. Reach out to us through our website, through our social media platforms. We're available to walk you through some next steps in that. We're going to go into a time of communion now where we remember and honor Jesus' sacrifice for us. When we celebrate the fact that his death makes us his. His death makes us his people, for those of us who choose to fall under his leadership and make him our King and our Savior. So we go into a time of communion where we break bread, or we eat a cracker or bread that represents his broken body, and we drink juice that represents his shed blood on the cross for us. He died so that we might live. So go get that ready in your home. Take a few minutes, and just quietly reflect on what Jesus has done for you.
my chains, I'm a prisoner no more. My shame was a ransom he faithfully bore. He canceled my debt and he called me his friend. Oh, when death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down over us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Our Savior displayed on a criminal's cross. Darkness rejoiced as though